Мобильные гуманитарии.
Global aid industry.
Widersprüche des Humanitarismus.
Podrían informar al humanitarismo.
Notion de distance, de proximité et de l'autre.
Hello and welcome. My name is Ann-Christin. I'm a historian of humanitarianism and international development. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this episode of Mobile Humanitarians, a webinar series in which we explore the intersections between humanitarianism and mobility of different kinds, including mobilities of people, finance, commodities and ideas, and everything in between.
Hello, my name is Tim Ostrovlansky. I'm an anthropologist at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And it's a great pleasure to welcome our guest today, Ann Zuntz. She's a lecturer in anthropology of development at the University of Edinburgh. Ann is an economic anthropologist who has really extensively researched the nexus of labor and migration in global economies, particularly in the Middle East and in the context of the Syrian conflict. She has a long list of publications on these topics. I would just like to highlight two prize-winning articles. 2018, Ann published the article Remapping the Holy Land from the Margins, How Jordanian Evangelical Churches Juggle the Local and the Global in the Syrian Refugee Response, which was published in Contemporary Levant. In 2021, she published the article Refugees, Transnational Livelihoods and Remittances, Syrian Mobilities in the Middle East before and after 2011, was published in the Journal of Refugee Studies. Then also in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, Ann led a research project titled Refugee Labor Under Lockdown, in which she collaborated with Syrian academics and which resulted in the graphic novel, May God Bless the Hand That Works. We're of course going to put a link in the show notes for this book. Now today, Ann will talk about mobilities after displacement, refugee workers in global agro-food businesses in the Middle East. This is work that comes out of a broader collaborative research project. Welcome, Ann.
Hello, well, thank you so much, Agnieszka. My name is Ann Zuntz. Thank you so much for having me today. I just wanted to start by introducing you to the One Health Field Network and our collaboration with Syrian academics, because everything I'll be presenting today and that you'll hear about in my talk really comes out of collaborative research with Syrian academics in the Middle East. So I should say that at Edinburgh, I'm a member of the One Health Field Network, which was established by Professor Lisa Bowden from the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Security in 2019. And what makes the network special is that we work together as social and agricultural scientists and also artists on the intersections between forced migration, refugee labor, and food security in the Middle East. And some of our colleagues in the One Health Field Network are Syrian academics who are themselves refugees and who were supported by the Council for At-Risk Academics. If you've never heard of the Council for At-Risk Academics, it's a British organization that supports academics in conflicts and displaced academics. And I wanted to start by highlighting this because you really need to understand that all the research we're doing together in the network is co-designed and co-produced from the beginning to the end. So we also co-publish all our results. And that's really important to us because we're very aware of the fact that especially the Syrian refugee crisis has produced some forms or has revealed older forms of extractive modes of research production and knowledge productions where often people in the Middle East, including from displaced communities, are just used to collect data, are used as research assistants. And that's a mode of research that we absolutely want to avoid. And it's really important for us to be aware of and to consciously address the kind of power inequalities that might come with co-producing research.
Hello everyone, my name is Ann Zuntz. I am a lecturer in anthropology of development at the University of Edinburgh and a member of Edinburgh's One Health Field Network. The One Health Field Network, founded by Professor Lisa Bowden here at Edinburgh in 2019, brings together agricultural and social scientists as well as artists from the UK and the Middle East. Some of our members are Syrian academics who are supported by the Council for At-Risk Academics, which is a British organization that assists academics in conflict. We all work together on projects that look at the intersection of forced migration, refugee labor, and food security in the Middle East. Today, I'm going to discuss the complex links between mobility and humanitarianism, taking the case study of Syrian refugees working in agriculture in the Middle East. What's interesting about these refugees is that many remain mobile after displacement. As farm workers, they frequently change employers, and they have often joined seasonal migration circuits in host countries. But all kinds of other things also move in their story, including agricultural commodities and money flows. To put this differently, the orange that you might have had for breakfast this morning could have been picked by a Syrian refugee in Turkey. As an anthropologist, I'm interested in the social and cultural life of refugees' mobilities. And today I'll give you a glimpse of refugees' intimate relationships at the beginning of agricultural supply chains. I will draw on data from a series of projects that I've been involved with since 2019 with colleagues from the One Health Field Network. And I will present an in-depth analysis of data from one particular project, which is the Refugee Labour Under Lockdown project. Besides Syrian colleagues, the Refugee Labour Under Lockdown project also included practitioners from Development Workshop, a Turkish non-profit cooperative. And you can find a full list of all people involved in the research on my slide. I should also note that all drawings on my slides were prepared by the artist Sophia Nielsen based on ethnographic data that were collected for the project. In a nutshell, the Refugee Labour Under Lockdown project sought to document how COVID-19 related movement restrictions and economic effects have changed working conditions for displaced Syrians in agriculture in the Middle East. And to this purpose, we conducted remote ethnographic interviews in 2020 and 2021 with 80 Syrian agricultural workers, 20 agricultural intermediaries, and 20 agricultural employers in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and northern Syria. In addition, workers were also asked to document their lives through WhatsApp diaries, and the drawings you'll see on my slides, again prepared by Sophia Nielsen, come from this visual material that we collected for the project. But I would like to start with a picture that I took before the pandemic. These pictures were taken in Adana province in western Turkey in December 2019 during the citrus harvest. So if you indeed had an orange for breakfast this morning, this is where your orange might have come from. In December 2019, my Syrian colleague Dr. Shaha Abdelatif and I hitched a ride with a young Turkish businessman to his citrus orchards an hour's drive away from the Turkish city of Adana. And the man in the car was keen to present himself as a global entrepreneur. He sought to impress us with big numbers about export opportunities for Turkish agriculture to the EU. So during the 1 hour-long drive, I learned that his orchards produce 600 tons of oranges, 1,300 tons of tangerines, 400 tons of lemon each season. However, the same man had very little interest in agricultural production itself. While we saw dozens of workers in his orchard that day, he explained to us that he only had 4 guys on his payroll. The reason for that is that in much of agriculture, recruitment and payment of workers is outsourced to others, so-called intermediaries or labor contractors. And in the case of this Turkish entrepreneur, the labor contractors, the people who actually hired the workers, were local men from surrounding villages in Adana province. But what I found most interesting is that the Turkish landowner had no idea who lived in the tents close to his orchards. He had no idea who the workers were. In some of these tents, there were Syrian refugees, but in other tents, there were internal Turkish migrants from the south of Turkey. And the only way you could tell is if you looked at the license plates of the cars that were parked outside the tents. I wanted to start with this picture, because this is clearly not just a refugee story. It's a story about how refugees become a particularly cheap and exploitable workforce for globalized businesses, alongside other cheap and exploitable migrantized workers. And in fact, refugee labor has an awful lot in common with temporary migrant labor. Most of Syria's 6.6 million refugees outside the country have remained in Middle Eastern countries, which are either not signatories to the 1951 Convention on Refugees, such as Jordan or Lebanon, or are signatories to the convention but do not recognize Syrians as refugees under the convention. That is the case for Turkey, for example. That means that Syrians in the Middle East may find themselves in a variety of legal humanitarian statuses, but in practice have limited access to the formal labor market and limited rights at work. In the Refugee Labour Under Lockdown project, no one had ever signed a formal work contract, so this kind of work is fully informal. But importantly, refugee workers' legal ambiguity is not just a byproduct of bad humanitarian governance. It is actually a standard tool for states that govern temporary migrant labor around the world. A standard tool to govern foreign populations that are considered desirable as workers, but not as potential citizens. And it's not a coincidence that in many cases in Middle Eastern agriculture, refugee workers do not compete with locals, but rather with other migrants. So in Jordan, for example, another important host country for Syrian refugees, refugees in agriculture compete over farming jobs, not with locals, but with Egyptians who have entered the country as labor migrants. As you can imagine, lockdowns and movement restrictions at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic hugely affected a sector like agriculture, which thrives on mobility. Agricultural inputs have to reach fields and greenhouses, workers have to get to their workplaces, and agricultural goods like the orange you might have had this morning have to reach local and international markets. That means that temporary disruptions of agricultural supply chains at the beginning of the pandemic hugely affected refugee workers. Among those interviewed for the Refugee Labour Under Lockdown project, 3/4 of workers had lost their jobs temporarily, and almost all workers reported decreased income and that they found it more difficult to find jobs in agriculture compared to before the pandemic. At the same time, almost 40% of workers said that employers and intermediaries had not introduced any COVID-19 safety measures. So, for example, employers and intermediaries did not impose mask wearing in the buses that transported workers to the fields. They did not make available hand disinfectants. They did not impose social distancing. And as I said, this kind of work is fully informal for workers, and no workers in our studies benefited from, say, paid sick leave. So what does this mean? It means that even short-term changes to employment damaged refugee households that had entered the pandemic with no financial safety net. And with rising job insecurity, refugees' bargaining power over their working conditions had further decreased, which means that even at the beginning of the pandemic, when work was inherently unsafe, refugees had to go back to doing this kind of work. But let's step back from the statistics for a second. What does this kind of work feel like? What's the lived reality of being a Syrian refugee during the pandemic, working in agriculture? I'm going to play you a little song in a minute. The song is part of a video that was submitted to our study by a 32-year-old man who lives in a camp in northern Syria, a camp for internally displaced Syrians. The camp is very close to the Turkish border. The man who submitted the video lives in a household of 8, including 4 children and his elderly parents, and the participant in our study was the only breadwinner in the family. When we interviewed him in December 2020, he earned the equivalent of 5 or 6 British pounds a day for 8 hours of work, harvesting olives and pruning trees with only a 30-minute break a day. And like many Syrians in our study, this man had lost his job temporarily at the beginning of the pandemic. He was now being paid more infrequently, and his family had had to sell household belongings to cope. The last time his family had eaten meat was for Eid al-Adha. That was 5 months before we interviewed the man. And this man submitted to us a video that he'd recorded on his phone of a young man, presumably a colleague or a relative, who sings during his lunch break during the olive harvest. That in itself is not surprising. Many participants shared pictures of lunch breaks with us, of workers sleeping, eating, even of workers dancing. Because lunch breaks are important moments during the day. They break the monotonous rhythm of farming labor, but they're also moments for conviviality and family time. The song that is part of the video recording is very beautiful, so I'm going to play you the recording in full now.
روح امشي من قدامي وشلون عالم هاي وما دام تحكي بظهري يعني تظل وراي ما دام تحكي بظهري يعني تظل وراي ولا يضرك انسان وجهك عفان وتغير الوان باوع وياي تضحك النهار وصحيح دمعك هدني نهاية البداية ما دام تحكي ظهري يعني تظل وراي.
In the video that comes with the song, you can see that most of the workers during the olive harvest are very young men. This is because this is backbreaking labor. It's the kind of work that many people start very young and that they cannot sustain for long. On my slide, you can see an extract from our graphic novel that was prepared by Sophia Nielsen, with a free translation of the song lyrics that was provided by one of our Syrian colleagues. The song you just heard is a song about fatigue, about extreme exhaustion. It also alludes to potential conflicts in the workforce and about God and religion. As many workers in the study said, if there is a problem at work, the only one they can turn to is God. So why do refugees keep doing these jobs? I would like to give you two explanations. Both explanations have to do with how agricultural supply chains function and how relationships of dependency develop within them. First, consider the complicated financial arrangement which is laid out by a 55-year-old Syrian intermediary in eastern Lebanon. So as I said before, the recruitment and payment of workers is often outsourced to intermediaries. So most refugee workers will never actually get to see the employer or the person who owns the land they're working on. But as you can see in the quote on my slide, often intermediaries do so much more for workers and their relationship is much more complex. So this man who lives with his workers in eastern Lebanon is responsible for a group of 67 Syrians, 40 of whom are women. And he also runs the informal camp that workers live in. I don't have time to read out the quote in full, but I encourage you to pause the recording and read in your own time. This intermediary's bookkeeping efforts show that he is involved in the payment of refugees' wages and also sometimes advance payments, which refugees then pay back through their salaries throughout the agricultural season. But he is also in charge of running costs, including for electricity, rent, and bread. And while the intermediary settles his accounts with refugee workers every couple of months, in the meantime, refugees keep accruing new debts for living expenses. Intermediaries keep track of payments through keeping ledgers and handing out cards to refugees that later serve as proof of the total working hours. And as the intermediary statement illustrates, advance payments are subtracted from workers' first salaries or outstanding wages at the end of the harvesting season. So what you see here is an incredibly complicated financial arrangement with different kind of expenses, different kind of payments on different timelines. And unsurprisingly, the financial complexity of these arrangements is exacerbated by increasingly irregular payment rhythms during the pandemic. Now, you might think that this intermediary is a cold-hearted exploiter and that he's cashing in on refugees' precarious situation. But in fact, we found that during the pandemic, many intermediaries ended up themselves in debt at the end of the agricultural season because these financial relationships had become too complicated and because they also owned money to other parties, including employers and landlords. Now, the case on my slide is an extreme case. Not all intermediaries are refugees' landlords. In fact, across the Middle East, most refugees do not live in either formal or informal camps, and some refugees find jobs on their own, so without intermediaries. But such complicated financial relationships, and in particular the practice of advance payments, which refugees then have to pay back through the agricultural season, are at the core of how refugee labor in agriculture is organized. And even though most Syrian refugees experience no physical coercion by employers or intermediaries to do this kind of work, they do experience a sort of unfree labor in the sense that economic necessity and accruing further debt compels them to take these jobs. Unfree labor in this sense may not look like historical forms of forced labor. Importantly, the unfreedom here does not lie at the beginning of the work, because after all, no one forces these workers to work in agriculture. But rather, unfreedom lies at the end. Workers just cannot stop doing this kind of work because they're constantly repaying their debts while further falling into a debt spiral. Seen through a political economy lens, Syrians' experience of unfree labor is thus the product of globalized agro-food businesses and their need for mobile workforces. So think back to the Turkish business owner I introduced you to at the beginning of my talk. But also host countries with stricter refugee reception policies, which produce these kind of cheap exploitable workers. But where a political economy approach to displacement falls short is when it comes to understanding how particular people in particular places are drawn into global capitalism. And this is what makes this not just a global, but also a Syrian story. And here I would like to develop a proposition made by Ann-Christin on the role of cultural difference in global supply chains. We tend to think of global capitalism as a homogenizing force. We tend to associate it with processes of standardization. However, Ann-Christin argues, diversity is actually not incidental, but vital to the functioning and expansion of supply chain capitalism. That means that supply chains feed on the existence of specific cultural niche. They exploit the existence of cultural diversity. And in the case of Syrian refugees, their niche is their peculiar way of making family. Work in Middle Eastern agriculture is deeply relational. So many of the workers who work together are either family members or come from the same village communities back home. That means zooming in on the ties in the workforce can be a unique entry point for understanding how exactly Syrian refugees get trapped at the beginning of global supply chains. And here I'll go back to the relationship between refugees and intermediaries. Policymakers and anti-human trafficking activists in the global north often vilify labor contractors as evil gang masters. But as you will see, this kind of language does not do justice to how Syrian refugees and intermediaries themselves describe their relationship with each other. The quote on my slide is an example of a Lebanese intermediary who's working with Syrian refugees in eastern Lebanon. And again, I'll just encourage you to just pause the recording for a second and read the quote in full. In a nutshell, what the man describes is a relationship of kinship, of proximity, and he says that this shared sentiment is based on years of living and working together. And note that this man is not even a Syrian refugee, he's not even biological kin, but he very much talks about the workers as if they were all from the same family. Another intermediary in eastern Lebanon describes the relationship with his Syrian workers as one of him being like a benevolent patriarch. He says that the girls of the camp call themselves the daughters of the intermediary because he not only finds them jobs, but he also arranges their weddings. Thus, the figure of the intermediary condenses the linkages between globalized businesses and host countries' refugee reception policies. And dynamics of exploitation are particularly effective because they are channeled through actors that Syrians have trustful and often kinship-like relationships with. Now, in a nutshell, what I've discussed today is how Syrian refugees in Middle Eastern host countries enter globalized agro-food business, and thus become entangled in mobilities and circulations of money and commodities, including after displacement. This means that we have to understand displacement as more than a one-off linear movement and rather as a complex configuration of mobilities. Instead of treating refugee labor as a localized humanitarian phenomenon, we thus have to look at the connections that make it a truly global issue and cut across the global north-south divide. That is, the complex migration and displacement flows and their entanglements with global supply chains. If refugees remain mobile after displacement, then this also calls for mobile solutions to displacement. So, for example, refugee families that live in tents and migrate with agricultural seasons might need mobile solutions to healthcare, education, and shelter. But I would like to end today with two provocative questions, which I hope will help us rethink the contentious relationship between different kinds of mobilities and humanitarianism. First, what we see today are optimistic humanitarian attempts at, once again, emphasizing refugees' economic self-reliance in a context in which countries in the global north are increasingly unwilling to take in refugees, but also unwilling to provide funding to provide for them elsewhere. But instead of asking, how can labor economically empower refugees, we might want to ask, how does labor trap refugees in an intergenerational cycle of poverty? So after all, the people I've introduced you to today are already working, at least most of the time, and yet they descend further and further into a debt spiral. Instead of asking, how can refugees become self-reliant, we might want to ask, how do refugees enter global supply chains and how are they positioned in them? What relationships of dependency do displaced people get caught up in global economies? And how are economic pressures passed down in supply chains to their weakest links? To put this differently, is refugees' inclusion into global economies the solution to poverty and exploitation, or does it become part of the problem? And second, I would like to suggest a more fundamental critique that would allow us to reframe refugees' role in the design and implementation of development policy. Humanitarians tend to frame refugees as people in constant need of upskilling. But the people in this research have often worked in agriculture for decades. In this presentation, I've looked at different types of mobilities. Mobilities of farm workers, of refugees, of agricultural goods, and also money. But what we often overlook is that refugees' expertise of certain professions has also traveled with them to new locations. So instead of approaching refugees as people that constantly have to be upskilled, what if we treat them like experts of their own livelihoods, who should have a say in the formulation of sustainable development policy? And this is exactly what we're going to do in our new project in the One Health Field Network. In our new project called Field Songs, we're going to work together with Syrian NGOs in the south of Turkey to document Syrian community-based knowledge on agriculture and to explore ways in which it can shape development policy in the Middle East. So please stay tuned.
Thank you so much for your talk, Anne. That was really a wonderful and fascinating talk with so many insights into refugee labor. Now, you describe in your talk displacement as a complex configuration of mobilities, and in this configuration, refugees really become part of global supply chains as agricultural workers. And sort of the way I understood this is that in a sense, their own mobility enables the mobility of things to other places, like the oranges you mentioned in your talk. But in the same process, the refugees' mobility also transforms. They live still in tents, but they now move with the agricultural seasons. So there is a massive change going on there in that sense. And it seems to me that these are quite rarely studied processes in the literature on humanitarianism. And I wonder how you see the refugees' position in this. What is their agency, and how do they perceive this change from temporary to also perhaps more permanent mobility?
Okay, if I can start, I think there's two things we might want to keep in mind. The first is that there's a wide variety of working situations for refugees in agriculture in the Middle East. So the refugees I introduced you to in my talk, the refugees who live in former tent settlements and move with the seasons, are one extreme case. But there are other people who live in rental accommodation more permanently. Some people live on site. Next to greenhouses, for example, more permanently. So not all of these people move all the time, but there are certain seasonal mobilities that many of them take part in. But just to say that there's a wide variety of living and working arrangements that that refugee farm workers in the Middle East can find themselves in. The other thing you have to understand that this kind of mobility is not exceptional. It's actually typical of agriculture in the Middle East and of Syrian farm workers long before they became refugees. So in Syrians before 2011 already were widely known in the region for being temporary migrant work, for engaging in seasonal migrations, in particular to Lebanon, where at one point there was more than 1 million seasonal Syrian workers, but also to other places in the Middle East, including to Jordan, which is something I've been working on for my PhD, but also to places further away, for example, on the Arabian Peninsula. So in a way, for many of these people, becoming mobile as a refugee and following the seasons wouldn't have been anything new. This might have been what they already did before 2011, before the Syrian conflict started. What is new is that before they became refugees, they usually had a place to go back to. They had a place called home, and a place that they could invest their savings and their remittances in, and a place often back home in the village that would have served as like an old age guarantee. Refugees these days, of course, have usually lost their houses. They have no place to invest in, no place to go to, and they find themselves in these precarious mobilities years after years without being able to regain a footing in their countries of displacement.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, the way in your talk that you move between mobility and the actors, I'm finding really fascinating. And it resonates with quite a few of the previous talks that we've had in this series in a few ways, and we can draw them out, I suppose, later in our discussion. But the main one that really struck me was how your refugee workers and intermediaries drew on languages of kinship to describe their relations, with agricultural labour, intermediaries and refugees, in both directions, it seems. As I said, this has come up in several of the talks that we've had in this series. It comes up in humanitarianism quite a lot, in the history of humanitarianism and in contemporary studies as well. But I'm really interested to see it deployed in this instance, where it seems like a sort of starkly capitalist relationship between workers and overseers. It's difficult to imagine how that language of kinship sort of enters and makes sense here. So I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit more to me, sort of draw it out. Why do they use this language? Is this how humanitarianism, is this sort of specific to the humanitarian context, or is it also part of that broader pattern that you've just described to us? And what kind of work, secondly, does this language do in the context of the differences in status, in class, in precarity, I suppose, that refugees have, as opposed to intermediaries or employers?
Thank you. So this is indeed one of the most interesting findings of the Refugee Labour Under Lockdown project. It's how workers and intermediaries describe their relationship with each other. Now, if you look at the literature, if you look at policy-oriented literature, especially on modern slavery, and if you look at anti-human trafficking activism, then these kind of intermediaries are often described as eagle gangmasters. So they are the villains in the story. And it's certainly true that there's a huge relationship of dependency between refugee workers and often the intermediaries, the labor recruiters, the people who get them the jobs. This kind of relationship of dependency is often financial. So in many cases, refugee workers get an advance payment from the intermediary that they then have to pay back through their salaries. But often refugee workers also depend on intermediaries for all kinds of other things. For example, for staying in an informal tent settlement, for access to electricity, water, even bread, even shopping expenses. But first, again, what we also found is that these relationships often predate the current Syrian refugee crisis, in the sense that we found cases, especially in Lebanon, where Syrian workers and Lebanese and Syrian intermediaries had moved and worked together long before 2011. So these are often long-standing, sometimes intergenerational relationships with intermediaries. But the other interesting point is that not all intermediaries are actually biological kin. Many come from workers' extended family networks or former village communities, but not all of them. So, for example, in Lebanon, we have cases where Syrians work with Lebanese intermediaries. But this language of kinship is still widely used, and I feel it does several things. The first thing you have to understand is that the relationship with the intermediary has to be based on trust. The intermediary is the one person on the field who can secure refugees' rights. So when we ask refugees what makes a good intermediary, they say the good intermediary will guarantee our rights. He will make sure that we get paid on time. He will make sure that the working conditions are okay, that there's no violence on the field. And sometimes he will also take care of our living arrangements. So this intermediary, it's a very important and vital relationship. But at the same time, using this language of kinship is also about belonging. So in many ways, intermediaries and workers talked about each other in quite moving ways, right? So like some of even the Lebanese intermediaries talked about their Syrian workers in the sense that they say, we are one people now. We've been living and working together for many years. I eat lunch with these people every day. One of the intermediaries said, we share bread and salt, which is a huge gesture of shared hospitality. But it's also a language of patriarchal obeisance, in the sense that, of course, the intermediary controls the worker. He controls their living arrangements, he gives them orders where to work, he supervises them while they're at work, and sometimes he also interferes with their more private relationships. So, for example, we talk to intermediaries who also arrange weddings for the daughters of their workers. So this kind of language of kinship is interesting because it does all kinds of things. It has an economic dimension. It's about belonging, trust, power relationships. But it definitely is way more complex than a simple kind of economic dependency.
And interesting. Sorry, Till, if you forgive me. I was when you were talking, Anne, it struck me that your answer to both of our questions so far has been to highlight continuity with pre-2011 times. So maybe if I could sort of push you back to Till's question, is there a sense of difference to the refugees? What are the differences or similarities? How, I don't want you to quantify them, but perhaps explore them a little bit more. How did that process of becoming a refugee, needing to access different forms of humanitarianism, if you could just perhaps draw out what those distinctions are and what the continuities might be?
Okay, I think there's a number of differences. First, some refugees now work in areas where they wouldn't have worked before 2011. So, for example, some of the refugee workers include, in our study, work in Turkey, where they never worked before they became displaced. And there they work with Turkish intermediaries. And we found that when Syrians work with intermediaries who are not Syrian, the relationship of trust is much less and can be much more exploitative, precisely because they often don't have this shared language, literally a shared language, but also the shared language of kinship in common. But what's also interesting is that this institution of intermediaries has moved with refugees. So, for example, it was quite uncommon in Jordan before 2011, and Jordanian NGOs like Tamkeen say that was the Syrian refugees who introduced the labor contractor in agriculture to Jordanian agriculture after 2011, because it wasn't a widespread feature of Jordanian agriculture. So these Syrians have also Syrian refugees have also brought forms of labor organization with them to new places. And of course, as I said, relationships of dependency have been exacerbated in the sense that Syrian refugees have no places to go back to anymore. But at the same time, we've also, before the pandemic in Turkey, already spoke to humanitarian actors who had identified intermediaries as potential new contacts for aid workers. So I think it's also increasingly recognized that instead of vilifying these intermediaries, they could also actually be useful sources of information for the aid sector and useful points of contact, especially in cases of emergency, because intermediaries always know where the workers are and how to reach them.
That's really, I mean, the whole discussion now about intermediaries is so fascinating, because I feel like in the previous episodes we talked about like humanitarian professionals, however we defined them, and how they stand in kind of relations of kinship, and they have these different types of mobilities that they bring into the picture, and this seems to be now here replaced with really that figure of the intermediary. That's extremely fascinating. And what I loved about your talk is that it gives you it gives us this this window into the complexity of the whole region and mobilities across the whole region, global aspects that come into the play, and so many different actors, the intermediaries you just mentioned, but then also in one of your articles that I enjoyed tremendously, the evangelical humanitarians in Jordan. And I would really love to hear a little more about how humanitarianism and religion intersect here, because it's really sort of also an understudied topic in many ways, and I feel we can tease out so many relevant processes looking at your work that is really so multifaceted.
Okay, so what Till is referring to here is my earlier work with evangelical humanitarians in Jordan that became involved in the Syrian humanitarian response that comes mostly from fieldwork that I conducted in Jordan in 2016. And that's another interesting case of people who provide important services to refugees, but might be at the fringes or even under the radar of the international humanitarian system. So what Till is referring to is my research with as a Jordanian evangelical church, but also European evangelical volunteers in Jordan in 2016. And I should explain that this happened in a context where there were a lot of Syrian refugees. There were a lot of big international aid organizations coming into Jordan. But Jordan also has very lenient visa regulations for people traveling from the global north, which means it was also, at the time when I was doing my PhD research with Syrian refugees there, it was also becoming a country that attracted a lot of volunteer humanitarians. And I guess we can easily see parallels here with other forms of volunteer humanitarianism at the same time, say, for example, on Greek islands or along the Balkan route in Europe. So a similar story. What's interesting, though, is that a lot of these volunteers had an added motivation, which was religious. So there was a lot, which again has to do with the fact that Jordan has its own evangelical community. Jordan is one of the heartlands of Christianity. It also happens to be right next to the Holy Land, which made it, again, very attractive for volunteers with religious motivations from abroad. Of course, the irony of this is that where I was doing my PhD fieldwork, for example, 100% of the refugees were Muslims.
And just to follow up, sorry, Agnieszka, I mean, the topic of religion sort of doesn't come out in your talk about refugee labor, but is there any relevance of these kind of actors in this context as well?
It's honestly not something we looked at for the refugee labor project. For the refugee labor project, we really sought to understand. How refugees were positioned in agricultural supply chains. But I think the broader parallel here is that refugees are embedded in transnational networks and in transnational commodity chains, be it an agricultural supply chains that connects refugee workers to transnational markets, or be it the evangelical volunteer coming from the Midwest to northern Jordan, who himself or herself is embedded into global transnational religious networks and thus is able to resource funding and other forms of support and then bring them to refugees. So I guess the parallel here would be the abundance of transnational connections, which also undercut easy global north, global south distinctions.
Right.
I think also another parallel that I'm sort of drawing in your work is perhaps what the transnational actors and especially NGOs and multilateral organizations think is happening. So how they seek to organize flows of people, labor, agricultural chains, value chains. But then what happens on the ground and how that seems to be different, and how along the way refugees, intermediaries, sort of lower level people organize space and commodities in quite different ways.
A lot of this also comes back to like questions of kinship and also intimacy, like who is directly relevant to refugees' lives, who are the kind of people that refugees encounter. So from my experience doing research with Syrian refugees, the people they deal with on an everyday life first are the people who get them jobs, who are often from their own networks, so that's the intermediaries, but also volunteer humanitarians are also often the ones who play a more direct role in refugees' lives, because they are the ones doing house visits. And that's not only true of, say, evangelical volunteers, say in the Middle East, for example. There were also a lot of local volunteers. There were also volunteers financed by money from Saudi charities, right, or from charities in the Gulf. But what all of them have in common, and I guess that's a bit different from the more institutionalized international aid system, is that they actually come to refugees. They sit with them in their living rooms. They have a relevance to their everyday lives. They care about their feelings, right? So that's very different from standing in the queue if you're registering with an international aid organization.
Yeah, and I've sort of found similarly in my historical work on volunteers, Western volunteers in development contexts, that they're often, as you say, that very ground level personal contacts seem to come from them. To sort of go back to that point of how people and things might be organised as opposed to how they really play out on the ground. Just before we started recording, you were telling us about current work you're doing in Tunisia, where it seems, again, this is coming up. So you were saying that the way in which perhaps the state and the UNHCR might wish to organise refugee mobility doesn't necessarily play out on the ground. Do you want to tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I was lucky to spend 3 months in Tunisia last year between September and December, together with the German-funded MECAM Institute in Tunis. And I was in Tunisia because I was interested to know whether there were any Syrian refugees there. And you might say, well, Tunisia is very far off and might not be a traditional destination for Syrian refugees. But it turns out that there are several thousands of refugees registered with the UNHCR. And we also found a quite substantial community of Syrian businessmen and women who might have entered Tunisia as migrants after 2011 and never even got in touch with the humanitarian system. And that's an interesting case study. Again, first because Tunisia is often considered a transit country. It's not often considered by policymakers a country where refugees actually stay. But of course, it has become this kind of country for at least some Syrian refugees. The other interesting thing is that it's a country where many Syrian refugees are registered by the UNHCR. They obtain an asylum seeker card in the absence of domestic asylum legislation in Tunisia. But many of these people remain surprisingly mobile. So one of the big outcomes of the study that I conducted with Tunisian academics this time is that many Syrian refugees keep crossing the border to Algeria, not because they want to live in Algeria, but because they want to visit family members, but also to obtain new Syrian passports from the nearest Syrian embassy, which is in Algiers. But there's also all kind of other mobilities that continue after displacement. And that's what Syrian refugees in Tunisia might have in common with, say, Syrian farm workers in the Middle East. So, for example, Tunisia is home now to a sizable Syrian Dom community, so a Syrian traveler community. And these are people historically mobile, so they move a lot inside Tunisia between different agricultural seasons, also touristic destinations, which makes it quite hard for local aid workers to keep working with these people because it's just hard to track them down. And as we learned, Syrians in Tunisia circulate all kinds of things. They don't only travel abroad to get new passports, they also use brokers to obtain new passports. In one of the most extreme stories we heard, someone used a broker to obtain a new Syrian passport from the Syrian embassy in Venezuela. Other Syrians send brokers of family members to Jordan, Lebanon, or even to Syria to obtain new passports. But Syrian refugees also obtain all kinds of other things through brokers, be it traditional dresses, traditional spices, and in some cases even wives. And that again is interesting because clearly there is a great degree of mobility, and there are multiple circulations that refugees keep being involved on after displacement, after they have settled in a country like Tunisia. And it's important to account for these because they have an impact on how refugees design livelihood strategies, how refugees survive, and what kind of plans they make for the future.
Thank you, Anne. This talk and this discussion has been so wonderfully rich and enriching for our series as well, because it shows us so many additional multiple layers that we haven't explored yet, and I guess that you keep on exploring in your research. And yeah, thank you so much again, and all the best.
Thank you.